Lesson 2, Spoken Latin. Michael, right here at the beginning of the book, I wanted to address the topic of spoken Latin. It's an important topic, especially today, because the way Latin is taught is changing, and changing rapidly, I would say. Many years ago, when I learned Latin for the first time, we never spoke Latin in the classroom. We memorized grammar rules, we memorized charts, we memorized endings, and then we tried to read or decipher Latin sentences. That's what you might call the grammar translation method of teaching Latin. And that's just the way I learned. We never treated Latin as an actual language that people used. We treated it just as a language that could be used to read texts. So, Michael, I think we would both agree that today's Latin education methods are changing.
Absolutely.
And you being a teacher, can you describe what's happening today in the world of Latin education, how it's changing, what it used to be, and what it's changing to?
Sure. So just like you were talking about, Bill, when I first started learning Latin 15 years ago in high school, we did the same kind of thing. We memorized paradigms, we translated from Latin into English. If we had a particularly committed teacher, we might try to go in the other direction and write some things in Latin that we had already seen in English. But for the most part, there wasn't much thought to anything beyond being able to pronounce the words if you saw them on the page. But these days, we have spoken Latin events commonly called conventicula, where teachers go and we immerse ourselves and we really start to get this faculty of speaking in us, not only because it's a wonderful task and a wonderful thing that we can do that we enjoy, but because it lets us go back into the classroom and be better teachers. And in turn, once you've internalized this language through speaking, and of course this isn't true just for Latin, but it's changing more and faster in the Latin community than it did before, it lets students read texts faster.
So, Michael, you used the word immersion a moment ago. You said that when Latin teachers go to some of these spoken Latin workshops, they immerse themselves in the language. When I hear the word immersion, that makes me think of a modern language. So are you saying that we're starting to treat Latin not only as just a literary language, a language that we use to read texts, but as a language that we can actually use to talk to each other?
That's exactly right. You need to be able to ask where the bathroom is at these events. You need to be able to ask how to get dinner at these events. You know, you need to be able to talk about your day-to-day life because you're talking to real live people right there in front of you.
So this is really exciting. People are speaking Latin again. And, you know, it's not crazy that people are doing this because, you know, the ancient Romans spoke Latin for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, according to Roman tradition, the city of Rome was founded in 753 BC, right?
April 21st.
And the fall of the Roman Empire was what, in the 5th century?
Well, the fall of the part of it that was in Europe, but we won't bore you with all those historical details right now.
Well, that's not boring. That's fun history.
Well, if you want that...
If you're a boring guy like me, it's fun.
Well, I guess we're both boring guys, Bill.
So the ancient Romans spoke Latin for at least 1,000 years. People in the Catholic Church spoke Latin in their churches and cathedrals. In the Middle Ages, they spoke Latin in the universities. I was reading a book a while ago about Trinity College in Dublin, saying that at their exams, they used to be all in Latin and oral exams. So you basically had to speak Latin during your oral exams at Trinity College, Dublin. And I believe that was just from the 1800s.
That's true.
So here's what we're saying, folks, is that speaking Latin is not crazy. Speaking Latin as a colloquial language is completely normal. The Romans did it, and everyone since that time has done it in universities, churches, and all kinds of places. So the idea of speaking Latin is not crazy. And if someone comes to you and says, hey, you can't speak Latin, then
Well, they're wrong.
they're just simply wrong. There's no nice way to put it. They are just factually wrong. You can speak Latin. Michael does it all the time. I do it all the time. Lots and lots of our friends and colleagues do it all the time. So you can do it. Lots of teachers speak Latin in the classroom these days. So this is the revolution that's taking place in the Latin classroom, is that people are starting to treat Latin not just as a script, not just as a something you write text with and read text with, but a true language that was used by people every day of their lives. It was a real language, just like the language that we speak every day, English. We use English for everything. That's the way they used Latin. And so that's the renaissance or the rebirth that we're going through right now in Latin education, is we're starting to appreciate Latin as a complete whole language.
And if I can just add on to that, Bill, we are having this renaissance in education, but don't imagine in your mind that it is only teachers and students who are using Latin in this way. At the Latin group that I am most frequently a part of course, many of them are Latin teachers, scholars at the university, or people who are ambitious to become one of those two things. But I can also tell you that there are many hobbyists, there are homeschoolers, there are people who pick up Latin for a variety of reasons.
That's great stuff. So this is where we are today in Latin education. Now let's move on a bit and talk about another extremely important topic.
All right. Let's talk about the benefits of spoken Latin a little bit then.
Yes, let's talk about why we should speak Latin in the first place. We've talked about the ancient Romans. We know that they spoke it. We know that it's a real language. We know that you can speak it. Now let's talk about why. Why should we do it, and what are the benefits of doing it? What do you get out of the speaking experience when you speak Latin?
Well, I would say first and foremost, you learn Latin better. We mentioned that Latin is a language, but we have to think a little bit about what that really means. Writing was, in sort of cosmic history, a relatively recent invention. People were talking long before writing. And so human brains, human minds aren't just meant to only experience things on the page. So that first benefit is by taking in the sound, by taking in the signs that represent the sounds of Latin language and actually producing them, we're learning better and in a way that's more like how you learned your first language and how you'd learn any other second language.
So you're saying that that language starts out as people talking to each other?
Absolutely.
Okay, because I think that many students of Latin approach Latin as if it starts in written form.
Exactly. And, that's perfectly natural. We don't want to blame anybody for that,
But
right?
it is wrong. It's not real. It's not true.
Oh, you're right. It's absolutely not true. The ancient Romans spoke Latin long before they ever wrote it. And scholars argue about how literate, that is, how many people could read and write in the ancient world, but they didn't have the same kind of educational system where we have today in the United States, where we can be reasonably sure that just about everybody can read and write pretty well.
So when we come at Latin viewing it just as texts, that's just wrong. The Latin language is not just a set of texts. The Latin language was a communication system that the ancient Romans used to talk to each other.
Well, and not just with each other, because we should think, well, why would we want to learn Latin? It's because we're going to communicate with those Romans, we're going to communicate with those ancient peoples, and the only difference between me having a conversation with Julius Caesar and me reading Julius Caesar is that the conversation only goes one way. I can only take from what Julius Caesar said, but even so, it's still an authentic form of communication, and we should think of it as such. So I think that's exactly right, Bill.
So what we have with Latin is an ancient language that was spoken all the time, but we just have texts that record that language in written form. That's all we have of it anymore. So that creates a tendency for some people to approach Latin only as a language you read.
Well, and here we want to talk about then some of the different kinds of reading, because one of the ways that we can read is the way you probably are imagining now, right? You can sit down on your couch and you can open a book and your eyes start at one end of the page and, without making a sound, you just understand what's happening on and you play that picture in your head. But actually, the ancient Romans didn't do that as much as we do. In fact, there are surviving stories that say that people marveled at Julius Caesar because he could sit and read silently. Ancient Romans were actually accustomed to, even when they had a text in front of them and were reading alone, to do it out loud. So in a way, even if you think, oh, well, I'm not going to do Latin conversation. Latin conversation isn't for me. You're still having a more authentic experience if you're working with the sounds of the language.
Because, as we pointed out a few minutes ago, language starts out as sounds. It starts out from the very beginning as people saying sounds with their mouths. Texts come later. Texts and written language comes later. So when you speak Latin and then read it, your language experience is, as Michael said, is matching more closely a real-life language experience. Basically, what we're saying is we don't want you to miss out on all the ways you can experience Latin. Help me out here, Michael. In my mind, the way you can experience language is 4 ways. You can experience it seeing it, that is reading it, writing it, speaking it, or hearing it. To me, those are the 4 major ways that we experience language. And if you only read Latin, you're just experiencing it in one out of those 4 ways.
That's absolutely right. And we have to be careful too, because sometimes we make a mistake of thinking that reading and translating are actually the same thing.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What's the difference between reading and translating?
Now, this is just a quick and dirty overview. I'll spare you guys all of the technical details, but to simplify it down for you, when we're translating a text, we're trying to move words from one language to another, and in doing so, we always lose something in terms of its meaning or what it was originally like. And in some of the Latin sentences you've seen so far, we can see this when we think about the order of the words. In English, I might say, I am going to the store. But if we say words in Latin order, we might say, to the store, I am going. Now, when I say those words in English, it seems like a kind of bizarre Yoda speak, like the little green guy from Star Wars. But when I say ad macellum eo, and I'm using Latin, it seems perfectly natural. So if we're only going to translate, we're going to lose that part. But okay, so I've talked a little bit about translating. So what about reading? So when we translate, we can sort of take the words on the page in any order, right? Like we can read through it from one end to the other, figure out which words we don't know, go back and forth until we've come up with an English text. But if we're reading, we're starting from one end of the page, over on the left side, our eyes are moving over to the right side, and we're trying to get that meaning directly without thinking about what the English words mean. If we use the Latin word for agricola, what happens in our mind is we think of the picture of the farmer, not, agricola means farmer. And then I think about, Old MacDonald and whatever associations I have with farmers when I think in English.
So, Michael, for me, the stuff you were just saying, for me, that's been the most amazing thing about learning how to speak Latin. Because for me, when I used to read Latin before I could speak it, here's what I would do. I would see a Latin word on the page. I would struggle to figure out its English equivalent, figure out what that Latin word means in English. And then once I had the English word, in my mind, then I could picture the meanings, the thoughts, the feelings that word is supposed to be giving me. And so later, what I realized I was doing there was really depending on English to understand Latin. I wasn't understanding Latin on its own. I always had to depend on a middleman, so to speak, the English translation word, to give me the meaning. And that's not really a direct language experience. And so what I've noticed is as I learned to speak Latin, instead of depending on a middleman, an English word, I'm forming more of a direct connection with the Latin language. The Latin words directly give me thoughts, feelings, and meanings without having to have some English middleman. And as I've gotten better and better at speaking Latin, I've noticed that English is fading away into the background when I speak Latin. And nowadays, I don't even think about English much at all anymore when I'm speaking Latin, because the Latin words, now after speaking Latin for so long, I can start to feel what the words mean without having to think about them so much. And it's been such a fulfilling experience.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit in a concrete way then about how students, and especially students who are working by themselves, autodidacts, can get some of that feeling and do some of that internalization of the language without English as a middleman as they go through the exercises.
Right, and we want you to experience that same feeling that we've seen a lot of people get. Michael, have you ever noticed that a lot of people say the same things after they complete a spoken Latin workshop? Have you ever talked to people and gotten their reactions afterward?
All the time, Bill.
And what do they always say? After they speak Latin for the first time, what do they always say? They always say the same thing.
Well, they say two things, really. One, they say, before I came here, I never imagined I could do that.
Right. They're just amazed at the fact that they could even speak Latin to begin with, that anyone even does it.
That's right. But then the second thing they say, and this is probably the more important one, to be honest with you, Bill, is they just felt a much closer connection to this language that they've been studying for years and years and years.
Yes, exactly. And so the catchphrase, Michael, that they always say, here's the one I always hear. They say, I never felt like I really, truly knew Latin until I started speaking it.
That's absolutely right.
I've heard so many people say that over the years. People, all kinds of different people who come to these workshops and they start speaking, they're just amazed at the feeling of it. They say, wow, I feel like now I really know Latin. And why is that? Because now they can express themselves in the language. They can actually use it the way the ancient Romans used it, as a daily spoken language. In other words, the way language is really used in real life.
Well, then let's circle back to those practical tips. And I'm going to start with what's probably a really obvious one. Read out loud. Get used to the feeling of salve on your tongue.
The lengths of the vowels.
Oh, absolutely. Now, of course, we all have accents, right? I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Bill, you're from North Carolina, right?
I don't have no accent.
Not no more. But we just use letters differently, So just do the best you can. Don't worry too much about your accent, but, do those vowel lengths.
And even if it's not perfect, just go ahead and jump in there and start saying the sounds and trying to say them. And you're going to really benefit a lot from that, because just the act of using your mouth to say the words is going to connect you with the language.
So what are some ways that you imagine a student who's sitting at home can play around with the language? They've got a couple of hundred words, and in their mind, they're going to tell themselves a story. And they're going to tell themselves that story in Latin words. What should they do?
Well, I think as they go through this book, they're going to pick up lots of things they can say, and they're going to hear them and read them so often that they can eventually start to say them on their own.
That's what I'm hoping, too.
Again, all these exercises are structured to be real conversations, as real as possible, to get you speaking Latin. So you can experience Latin as a real, living, genuine language, not just dusty old books on a shelf. Nothing against those dusty old books. I have plenty of dusty old books myself, and I happen to love them. But the Latin language is just so much more than that. It's so much beyond that. And here's one last thing. Before we leave this topic, Michael, I want to say one last thing. When you speak Latin, it helps you read texts. The better you get at speaking it, the more easily you're going to be able to pick up a text in Latin and just read it at sight. So the major thing we want to leave you with, as far as lesson 2 goes, is that you can speak Latin. You can speak it, you can bring it to life, it can be a language that lives and a language that you use. Speaking Latin is not crazy. It's not something we just made up. It's something you can do and should do to help yourself learn the language. Now, before we leave lesson 2, we want to look at this quick review box. What I want to explain here is that in Latin, the letter I can be used 2 ways. It can be used as a vowel and as a consonant. When you use it as a vowel, Michael, is that called a vocalic I?
Yeah.
And then when you use it as a consonant, that's called consonantal I.
That's exactly so.
So let's give them an example of each one. In the word nawago, nawago means I sail, right? So the letter I there is a vowel. Okay, it's just acting like a vowel between 2 consonants. But in the word yam, that's I-A-M, it's acting as a consonant. And when that happens, it sounds like a y. So I-A-M sounds like yam. And in many Latin textbooks, they use a J to represent consonantal I. So you're going to see it both ways. You're going to see the word yam spelled I-A-M and J-A-M. In this particular book, I'm going to use the letter J for consonantal I.
So in this quick review box, though, Bill, we have a pretty famous name you might want to go over.
And what would that name be, Michael?
Julius. But how do we hear that in English, Bill?
Julius.
Yeah, any particular Julius? Are you planning on getting an orange Julius? We need a snack in this recording?
I'm thinking about a salad, actually. Maybe a Caesar salad.
Oh, you're trying to... Oh, a Caesar salad.
Yeah, Julius, or actually the name Julius, as in Julius Caesar, that's a perfect example of a consonantal I. That J at the beginning of the word Julius really is the letter I in Latin, but that's a consonantal I.
And just to give you a hint, it's what's going to happen in lesson 3. Think about the name John in English, because in Latin, we often say that as Johannes.
Yes, another consonantal I.
So we'll talk more about that in lesson 3, right?
Yes, we'll see more of this coming up in the future. So let's go ahead and move on to lesson 3 here.